Those of you who know me a bit will not be at all surprised to hear me say that this gospel is one of my favorites. You see, I grew up in a household of 9, and my mother labored to put a home-cooked meal on the table every night. And when friends or neighbors would drop by unannounced, the food always seemed to stretch to be enough for everyone at the table. Dinner was always a collaborative effort in our house. Although Mom directed the operation, we kids would take turns setting the table, making a salad, clearing the table, loading the dishwasher, that kind of thing. Then during high school and college, I worked several food service jobs. And in graduate school, I was the head chef for a weekly community meal series at my divinity school. For 5 years, I worked as an organic farmer before I became a priest. My vocation to sacramental ministry truly grew out of these experiences of field and table. And so naturally, I am drawn to this account of how Jesus, out in a deserted field, granted one that became much less deserted once 5,000 people followed him there, how he finds a way to feed them all, and from a very small ingredient list. Coming back to this beloved story this week, I was drawn to a detail that I hadn't paid much attention to before, and that is the tenderness of Jesus' response when the disciples come and tell him about the smallness of their provisions, the mere 5 loaves and 2 fish. Notice he doesn't chide them for being slow of heart or scold them, calling them ye of little faith, as we see him do elsewhere when the disciples get it wrong. There's none of that harshness here. Now he just says of the bread and the fish, bring them here to me. And I find myself wondering what motivates this tender response on his part. Is it just humility or meekness? Or maybe an uncertainty about what he's going to do next? Or is it the exhaustion of his grief talking? You see, at the beginning of this story, Jesus is depleted and devastated. Our passage starts with him going off in a boat to a deserted place. And the reason he is trying to get away for some alone time is because in the verse just prior to this story, Jesus has been informed of the death of his cousin, John the Baptist. Jesus just learned that John, after a period of unjust imprisonment, had been executed in a truly horrific way by King Herod. John, his cousin and his fellow teacher, John, who had baptized Jesus in the River Jordan, launching his public ministry. In his shock and his grief, and maybe some fear too, Jesus tries to get away, but the crowds follow him. And I wonder why they did that. I wonder if maybe they were grieving and fearful too. After all, at this point in the story, John would have had more followers than Jesus did. Whatever the reason, Jesus sees them, and out of compassion, Matthew tells us, Jesus heals the sick in the crowd. But that doesn't exactly disperse the crowd as he may have hoped. So now they're there and they're hungry too. And the disciples come and bring this to Jesus' attention, as if he hadn't noticed it already. As if the hunger of 5,000 people in his retreat space was his problem to deal with. And yet, there they all were. So, like any good leader, like any good problem solver, Jesus takes stock of the resources at hand. A mere 5 loaves and 2 fish. It's not much, but it is something. Despite the fact that the disciples tell him about these loaves and fish in a sentence that starts with the words, "We have nothing here." It's not much, but it is something. And his response to them when this happens is not to correct them outright, but rather to instruct them. Bring them here to me. And then he blesses and breaks the bread, And in doing so, he shows them that what they have really is enough. What a remarkable moment that must have been for those followers of Jesus, to start sharing out that meager fare and to realize along the way that what they have really is enough. A striking insight for the 12 as well as for the 5,000 to learn that what they have is enough for all. I think about that scene. I look at how various artists depict it, like the one who drew the cover of our bulletin today. There's the crowd of 5,000, the 12 disciples and Jesus. So 5,013 people in all, by my math, sitting down to a simple, nourishing meal together. I picture it and I find myself wondering, what problem exactly was it that Jesus was seeking to address when he blessed that bread and showed them that what they have really is enough? Was it the problem of the hunger of 5,000? Well, certainly it seems it included that. But maybe what he had in mind was the problem of the poverty of 5,000 people. After all, if these were people of any significant means, they probably would have brought some food along, or at least they would have had no problem going to the nearby towns to buy some. Or was the problem that Jesus had in mind the 12 disciples' apparent lack of self-efficacy? You notice that after he blesses the bread, he gives it back to the 12. He makes it their job to do the sharing, their job to collect the extras and tally the outcome and learn what they will from those outcomes. Or maybe, just maybe, the problem that most informed his blessing and breaking of the bread was the problem of his own grief and fear. Grief and fear which perhaps they all shared to some extent. I wonder if in that moment Jesus realized that while nothing could take away the intense pain of his loss, there was something about sharing a meal with fellow mourners that made it a little more bearable, that helped him feel a little less alone in it. Or maybe he was addressing all of these problems at once. The agrarian philosopher and writer Wendell Berry would call that solving for pattern. What an incredible moment of good news this meal was to those food insecure first century rural Palestinians. To take, eat, and realize in doing so that what they have is enough for all to eat and be satisfied. Clearly, it made an impression on them and on the generations that followed, for this is the only miracle that gets recorded in all 4 of the Gospels. Gospels written by 4 different authors in 4 different places over the course of 4 decades. They all tell this story of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. It was a transformative insight for them, that enoughness of God's provision. And it can be, I want to argue, a transformative insight for us too. We, the 21st century disciples of Chicago's North Shore, to realize that enoughness of God's provision. Even though our context and our presenting ailment is quite different from that of the crowd in this story. For our problem is generally not one of scarcity, but rather of overconsumption. And while many in our midst still do go hungry today, that hunger is not a problem of scarce resources, but rather of the inequitable distribution of those resources. That enoughness of God's provision is a critical lesson for us as the church to realize, to internalize, and then to teach to a world that is literally dying of overconsumption. In closing, I want to share with you an image that is near and dear to me. I have here a replica of a mosaic. It is my most treasured memento from my Holy Land pilgrimage that I made some 15 years ago with my sister. This mosaic is laid into the floor beneath the communion table at a church in Galilee. It's called the Church of the Multiplication, and it's purported to be the site of this miracle that we read about today. The mosaic depicts 2 fish, which is consistent with most of the biblical accounts of this feeding miracle. But it only shows 4 loaves of bread, not 5. But the 5th loaf isn't missing. Instead, this simple image contains a profound claim. And that claim is that the 5th loaf is the one being broken and shared at the table just above the mosaic. It is a reminder written in stone that what we have is enough for all. We have nothing here but these 5 loaves and 2 fish, they said. And Jesus replied, "Bring them here to me." So friends, I invite you to heed the invitation of this gospel today. Whatever you have, bring it to God. God who will bless it and will bless your sharing of it. And as we approach this table and the bread we share this week and every week, let us hear and be transformed by the good news that enough really is enough. Amen.